Good afternoon.
Nice to see so many of you have returned. I was worried that you might need to drop the class. I think most of you have come back. Okay. Is anybody here who did not come last week? Apart from the lady there. Oh. What happened? Other classes were not so interesting? Have you heard good rumors about this class? Okay. If you haven't come last week, I'm not going to go over what I explained last week because obviously it's a waste of time for others. You can either wait until you can download things from Classes. Right? I upload my notes to Classes and the syllabus and all this instruction. I will upload it once it's ready after your photo is finished. Otherwise, you can send me an email and I'll send you the notes. And you can find my email on the syllabus, I believe. Otherwise, I'll just write it down here. I'll give you my Gmail. Okay. So it's Ken, first name Kizino, at Gmail. Okay. So if you weren't here last week, you need my notes, or you want to complain, or you have something you want to say, email me. Good. For those of you who were here last week, and some ground rules. As I said last week, I don't like it when people have their laptops open. Some people are unhappy about that, or they disagree. That's fine. But as I explained, basically, I'm going to give you detailed notes, right? I've typed it out already for you, so you don't have to furiously write down all the notes. You can focus more on what I'm saying and thinking about it rather than just generating notes. And there are studies saying that you can get more out of a lecture if you don't have your laptop open. Not just because of the distraction factor. Obviously, it's very distracting. You Google something, you want to check something, you want to send a Facebook message to your friend, whatever. And then for me, it's distracting because I start thinking, what are you looking at online? That's so interesting. So as I said, if you're bored, if you don't like this class, just step out. I don't really care. But if you're here, let's try and be physically present, mentally and attention-wise. Life outside of the classroom, there's so much internet, there's so much screen time, right? I think it's actually a very precious thing to have no screen, no online time. And I think already now, for professionals and for people who work, the sort of the effect of having so much screen and so much online has sort of serious. I don't know what exactly it's doing to our brains, but to be able to just sit and listen and look, ask questions physically, it's very precious time, I think. Okay, so that's all. Who was able to read the requested chapter? Raise your hands. Okay, not so many. Please read. Please go to the library. Okay? I expect you to have read from about next week what I ask you to read. Otherwise, it's difficult to follow. Now, if, as I said, there are 3 copies of the book, at which library? Yeah? Yeah? Yoshida Minato.
Yeah.
So 3 copies on the counter. You can photocopy, right? You're allowed to photocopy a chapter. Good. You don't, as I said, you can buy this book, but we're only going to use like 30% of the book. So it's about 5,000 yen. It's a very good book. It starts from Tokugawa, 1600 to 2015, 2013. It's worth having, but it might be a bit expensive. So otherwise, you can go to the library, or, because I'm such a nice guy, I bought 5 copies of the book with my own Kenkyuhi, and I will lend it to you at the end of class. First come, first serve. You can only borrow it for 1 week. So you can read all of it, or you can try and photocopy it. Or you can re-borrow it. Okay. And I'll take down your student number or email. And if you don't give back the book, you know what's going to happen. I'm going to come after you. Okay, so that's that. So today we're going to talk about the first part of this course is doing a kind of overview, going through the post-war history without going into specific topics, just do a chronological history. But of course focusing primarily on the interaction of politics and economics and what factors are driving changes in political economy of Japan. Okay. And we start, of course, 1945, end of the war and occupation. And this is sort of the foundation, the basis of so many things that happens in the rest of the 70 years that follows, 72 years that follows. A lot of things are determined. It's a very tumultuous time, a lot of things change. And a lot of sort of settlements are made. But within that period, 7 years of occupation, the seeds of all sorts of, Japan's post-war economic recovery and a sort of dramatic change in society, they're introduced at this time, but also the kind of tensions we see later in the period and conflicts we see in the period, in post-war period, are also partly a result of what happens during this period. So after the war, Japan is devastated, so much is up in the air, and people are wondering what's going to happen next. Some people think it's going to be the rebirth of the nation, and certainly it is a rebirth. And in that process, all sorts of things are set down, which stabilizes and helps recover Japan, but also at the same time, some things create tensions, and some tensions are not really completely resolved. So these are the kind of things we want to think about. I will try and lecture about 60 minutes. Stop me whenever you don't understand or whenever you think I'm going too fast. Okay? Everybody here, am I speaking too quickly? Raise your hand. Am I very honest? Good. Am I speaking too slowly? Okay. You might not get everything I'm saying. That's why you should read the book before you come. The book is also translated into Japanese, so you can get the same material. I recommend you read both the Japanese and English. Don't just read the Japanese. All right. The title is Occupation, Demilitarization, Democratization. Okay. No more class. Go home. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Okay. So I have several sort of themes we're going to cover. One is the fact, what was the situation in Japan at the end of the war? It's hard to imagine. Japan is such a rich country, and it's so stable and so well built up. You don't see any signs of war. 7 years of peace and stability and order. But actually, 75 years or so, the country was in a completely different situation as it is now. Those of you who haven't really studied Japan, which there might be, it might be good to know what it was like. Then we talk, of course, about the U.S. occupation, the Allied powers that won the war, occupied Japan, and it was mainly the Americans who dominated policy and decided most of the things that happened in Japan under SCAP, the Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, and it went on for 7 years. So this is probably one of the only times in Japanese history, it is probably the only time in Japanese history in which Japan was formally occupied by a foreign power. And for 7 years, that's quite a long time. And we'll talk about what sort of things they try to do to recreate Japan. Reborn Japan, a different image in their own image. And then the later part of the occupation, what is so-called the reverse course, when a lot of the promises and a lot of the reforms and plans started changing tack, changing direction. Both the goals that the Americans had in Japan and the ways in which they try to achieve them change. And we try to think about why that is the case, but also what effect that had later on in the period that we see after the 50s. Okay. Some things to think about, maybe that will raise this discussion, is this first one is, what elements of occupation contributed to Japan's post-war recovery and stabilization? So what elements, what sort of things did they do? What sort of policies, actions did they take, which helped Japan recover and also stabilize? And of course, you can ask, when you get a question like this, the first thing you should do is, what do these terms really refer to? What does it mean for stabilization? What do we talk about when we talk about elements? What about recovery? These are very broad terms. So depending on how you define them, you get different answers. First thing when you get a question, what do? Don't start trying to answer it. Just question the question. Okay, very simple. Who benefited and who lost? So 7 years of occupation, these different groups in society, different individuals, different companies, even different countries involved. Who won? Who are the kachigumi? Who are the makegumi in the occupation? And who benefited? It's not a neutral thing, right? There's always going to be some people who lose out. And why? Why did some groups manage to succeed in getting what they wanted? Right? This is a question of power in politics, but also maybe chance. Okay? And finally, this is not a question of substance or empirics. It is a question of method. In last class's lecture, I talked about what drives history, what shapes and creates historical change. Does anybody remember what I said last week? What were the different categories that I mentioned? Anybody? Yes?
Individuals.
Individuals. What was that theory called?
The Great Man Theory.
Great Man Theory, which is what? Can you explain to the rest of the class?
History is written or driven by influential men.
Yeah. Generally men, sometimes women. But because mostly historians are men, they tend to write about men, so that's patriarchy for you. Right, Great Man Theory. History is driven by the actions and thoughts and impulses and ambitions of big, great men. Okay? What's another category of historical change?
Social groups.
Social groups. Okay, so we don't think just individuals, but social groups. What kind of groups do we have that are often used to explain historical change? Don't be shy to raise your hands. It's your chance to practice your English. No, but you don't expect to speak in a lecture class. Anyway.
Ordinary people.
Ordinary people. Who are the ordinary people?
Many people.
Show me. I shoot. Yeah, okay. Let's break, that's good. Elites, political elites, ordinary people. But ordinary people are divided into different groups, right? Mm-hmm. Like what?
Like workers.
Workers. Yeah, what else? Marxist history is driven by this idea of the class, right? Different kind of classes. Workers and owners of companies. Capitalists. What other groups of people are there? Students. Students play a big role in post-war Japan in some parts of history, and in others not. What else? Yes? Did you? No, you're...
Agricultural people.
Huh?
Agricultural people.
Yeah, farmers.
Farmers, yeah.
Farmers, very good. Agricultural people, yeah. Middle class people, that's another kind of class, yes?
Military.
Military, yeah. Military is a group of people, but it's also kind of institution. And formal, yeah, very good. Let's go on. There are different kinds of groups of people. Immigrants. European history now is being made, and part of the major driving force is immigrants. Like Sweden, my mother's country, immigration is about 10-15% of the total population, those born outside of Sweden. And the clashes between these people and the native people, and between the political elites and the business and the regular workers and farmers. All kinds of interactions changes the economy and the politics. Okay, what other? Okay, so we have big leaders, social groups. What else?
Ideas?
Ideas, very good. Ideas are very important. But ideas are very difficult to measure. But what kind of ideas would you say? Give me an example.
Socialism.
Socialism. Yes, that's socialism. Yeah, that's an idea that spread through Europe in the end of 18th century, early 19th century. Communism, socialism, free market capitalism, neoliberalism, these kind of big ideologies. Nationalism, very powerful. What else? What other ideas? Yes, technological knowledge. That's an idea. To know how to split an atom and create a bomb. That's an idea. That's knowledge. Right? And because you have that, you can create technologies. And the course of history has changed forever because we have atomic bombs. If we didn't have idea about atoms, scientific method, all these things that build up to it, we would not have them. Okay, there are three more categories. Can you tell me quickly?
Natural power.
Natural
Power.
power. Would that be the right word? Natural power, like what?
Disasters.
Natural disasters. Natural events. Natural forces. 自然の力というか自然現象. So earthquakes, typhoon. Maybe Japan would have been occupied by the Mongols, right? In the 12th century, if you didn't have a typhoon at the right timing, right? Kamikaze, the history, famous story. Maybe we would not have this situation of energy, change in energy policy if we didn't have a big earthquake and the disaster in Fukushima. So, what other things in nature that did I mention? That's actually very interesting that we don't really focus on that much. Yes?
Disease.
Disease, yeah. Disease has a dramatic effect on societies, economies, politics, how it spreads, how it impacts community. Okay? There's a good book called Germs, Guns, and Steel. Long understanding human history because of the trade and spread of these technologies and disease. Okay, what other thing that were there?
Random events.
Random events, yes. What's random? I'll make something random. Anybody?
When it's like spontaneous and unexpected.
Spontaneous and unexpected. Aren't most things in human history unexpected?
It might be like planned and like.
Okay. Give me an example of a random event as opposed to a non-random event. Right? It's not that easy. Well, anyway, you can think about it. But what sometimes they say things that you don't think have any connection to an outcome has this impact. And the example I gave was our favorite example. Hitler, he wanted to become an artist. And he went to art school in Vienna, and he applied to become a student, and those professors there, they really messed up, and they said, no, don't come to art school. So he got rejected, and then he went off to become crazy and created massive wars across. So one can ask, is that a random event, or was that somehow caused by all kinds of structural forces? Anyhow, is that all? 5, 6 categories? Yeah, okay, very good. Anyhow, so this is a review, but then these forces and explanations, how much of these different categories are used in the textbook narrative, chronology? This happened, this happened, this happened, but there's also some argumentation as to why it happened and what forces caused it. And my main suggestion to you was that history is driven by an interaction of so many different forces. So you can't just say, it's only this that caused it. You have to show that all these things came together. And that's the difficulty of trying to come up with general theories or patterns, because each case is a bit different, and the combination of these factors are quite different. You can't pinpoint an independent variable. Like social scientists like to talk about independent variables and dependent variables. But that is 独立変数, 従属変数. history doesn't work that way. You have to have a broad mind and an interlinking mind. But that doesn't mean everything is equally important. That's the challenge. You can't say everything is because of everything. Well, if you're a Buddhist or whatever, if you have a philosophical view, everything is caused by everything. You have to try and see what is the most proximate, or at least the most weighty, heavy element in any development. Okay, so as you listen to the lecture, as you read the book, think about what kind of arguments are being used, what kind of combination of factors that will come to play. Okay, so let's start. So some pictures. End of the war, as you know, there was a lot of aerial bombings in Japan. We'll mostly focus about the atomic bombings being dropped in 2 cities in Japan. But even before that, we had tremendous aerial bombings at tremendous cost. Hundreds of thousands of people died, many more than in nuclear attacks in major cities across Japan. Destroyed the economic and industrial capacity of Japan's military, but also to demoralize, to make people so scared and so unhappy that they just give up and systematically go from one city to another get targeted. That's Nagoya, that's Osaka. Okay. Well, I'm not going to talk about the course of the war. That war came to an end 1945, August. When? August 15th, yes. And August 15th, the emperor, there was a recording of the emperor's voice, and he announced that Japan is going to surrender, so-called Gyokuin Hoso. And these people are listening to the radio. This is probably radio. And people are devastated. In this picture, but just because you see this picture doesn't mean you can't assume everybody was feeling this way, right? It's a very small sample of the Japanese public. It's a very strong picture, but in reality there might be people jumping around going banzai at all. Or some people don't care at all, by the way. These are people in front of the imperial palace bowing and, I don't know, feeling sorry or some kind of expressing some kind of solidarity with the emperor. It's often used. But as the book talks about, there's a mixture of emotions. Feeling of kyodatsu, feeling of lacking any kind of feeling, but also feeling of hope of finally this oppressive military state, ends and I can get some freedom back. And also a lot of concern about what will happen. Less psychologically or psychohistorically is the actual physical damage. Lots of cities were bombed. Out, as I said, you have this thing called Yakinohara. So as far as you can see, the fields are burned out. No buildings left. You have this very interesting phenomena of de-urbanization, that people leaving the urban areas go to the countryside. Post-war history is just essentially one direction, urbanization. Everybody leaving countryside, going to cities. And we'll talk about it a bit more. But in this period, what happened was people left the cities. Why? Why would you leave the city? Obviously, you at risk of getting bombed. And also because the food was getting scarce. So more chance of getting food access in rural areas. Because of the bombing out, there was a shortage of housing, obviously shortage of everything, but severe shortage of housing. Food production also very shortage, 60% compared to pre-war peak, which means in the pre-war there wasn't such an abundance of food, but that was half. So you have a situation of malnourishment, people not being able to eat. Very, very sad. We watched that. There's like kind of film, what was that called? Really sad. The little girl can't eat, so she has to eat dirt. Heartbreaking. And labor shortages, of course. Why labor shortages? Well, obviously, all the men were out to war. Many of them did not return, so there was shortage of manpower, which damaged, of course, production. People spending a lot of money on food. So this was really subsistence level existence. Cannot imagine compared to today. Everywhere you go, there's so much, too much. Pictures of Japan at the time, Katsugiya, people go to the countryside to sell their kimono or sell their things to buy just food. Okay, more macro. Economically, GDP level was a third less than in 1930s and 40s. Actually, GDP really stagnated once the war started. At the end of the war, economy was 1/3 bigger. It's a very big deal. Only 40% of the factories open. All of them bombed out. They also had a shortage of merchant marine. What's a merchant marine? Somebody. Anybody? Shosen. So, shogo, fune. Boats to export, import, carry things. Not military marine, but merchant. And you need that to import all these raw materials. You also need that to export stuff. If you don't have merchant marine, you can't do anything. Even if you have factories, you can't run them. And they didn't have currency to buy raw materials. Japan needs raw materials, coal, iron, rubber, oil, all these things for modern industry to work. So then you can't make things, you can't buy things. There's shortage of goods, currency is worthless, and you have hyperinflation. Okay? Now that was the situation, devastation situation. Very, very briefly, very simply. What was going on outside of Japan? Well, even before the end of the war, the Allied powers, represented mainly by the Americans, the British, and the Russians, the Soviets. The Chinese were also part of the Allied powers, but they were busy having a civil war as well. Internally, there was lots of problems. So in Potsdam, which is in Germany somewhere, the three leaders, Churchill, Truman, and Stalin, they came together and said, what were we going to do with the world? They're nice, they come together and say, discuss what to do with the world. That's a lot of power. But they discussed what to do with Japan as well. And in the declaration that came out of it, the statement after the meeting, this was what they said. We don't intend the Japanese to be enslaved or destroyed as a nation. Well, that's nice to know. But the Japanese government must remove. Going, quick, run. Must remove all obstacles to the revival and strengthening of democratic tendencies among the Japanese people. Freedom of speech and religion, thought, as well as fundamental human rights shall be established. So even at this point, they were already planning to make Japan into this kind of ideal democratic state. Okay? And they were not intending to destroy it or make it into a kind of colony. So these are the thoughts involved. And they told, we call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. Alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. In other words, if you don't surrender without any conditions attached, we are going to destroy you totally. And what happened? This is July 26th. What happened 2 weeks later? Atomic bomb. It started, right? And the declaration was made. So this is not a bit different from the situation we have now in the peninsula, where people are saying all sorts of things and not doing it. Nothing happens. But this was serious, and this was, of course, the first time in human history that they saw the power of the bomb. Okay, so this was already in play. Now, after the war, and of course, the surrender date on August 15th, immediately the American forces started to arrive late August, early September, and you have this man who you know. Who's this? MacArthur, General Willoughby S. MacArthur. What's his name? General MacArthur. What's his first name? Douglas MacArthur. So this general, and he's in charge of the Allied occupation. He's the supreme commander of the Allied power. Held by Douglas MacArthur. As I said, there's a lot of different things going on. The British, of course, and the other Allied powers are involved. But essentially, in the Far East Commission, it's the Americans who call the shots. Although, theoretically, the other powers had a right to say. And this is a very famous picture that they took in September 17th in the Daiichi Hotel, I guess, Daiichi Biru, near Ginza, Shimbashi. And this is who? The Emperor and MacArthur. And there's a lot of discussion and articles about how this picture was taken. And because the Emperor until then was what? A god. You're not supposed to even look at the Emperor to have a picture taken, nonetheless. And not a very nice picture, right? Nice as in, it's not very flattering to the emperor. What do you notice about the two?
The emperor is very stiff,
Very stiff, and he's also very
short.
short, like this. And General MacArthur is big, imposing, and very relaxed. A good point. And this was, of course, what? Propaganda to show the Japanese public that, okay, now he may have been a god, but he's no longer, and the Americans are in charge. And they start all kinds of reforms. Among them, the key, of course, the most urgent was to demilitarize, to decommission Japan's military, to disband the military. And of course, there were all these soldiers and military related personnel all over, not just in Japan, but across Japan's empire, which was quite big, even at the end of the war. And they had to find ways of disarming them and then getting them back to Japan. Some of them, of course, couldn't come back because they were trapped. Where? Where were a lot of Japanese soldiers trapped? In the Soviet Union or in China? And they were held there and made to work as prisoners of war in camps and so on. A very fascinating story. And when they did return to Japan, they had spent 7 years or longer, 5, 7, 10 years in Siberia or in camps in China, and they had been brainwashed, many of them, into communism. And when they arrived in the harbor in Japan, this is a kind of side story, they come to Maizuru-ko. A lot of them came back from Siberia or from China to Maizuru. Maizuru is where? どこだっけ? 日本の地理も勉強しましょう。north of Kyoto, right? Up there. And when they come, they have been in communist China or Soviet Union for so long. They're singing the Communist International, the workers' song, as the boat arrives into harbor. They're free now. They can land in Japan, but they say, no, we don't want to step into Japan because Japan has become this capitalist, imperial, still an emperor there, and we want to return to the communist heaven. I mean, they were so brainwashed. But once they returned, many of them sort of returned back to fitting into Japanese society. Rather interesting to think of these soldiers coming back and singing communist songs and saying, we don't want to step into Japan in Maizuru Harbor. Okay. But many soldiers had to be returned and repatriated. Many of these officials in Japan, there were a lot of military-related bureaucrats and military-related personnel. All those who were involved in Japan's military regime and operations, many of them were purged from office. Those who were seen as responsible for leading the war, involved in the war, they were kicked out of office in government and in bureaucracies and in the business world. What other things did they do? Well, this is not directly demilitarization, but they made Shinto no longer state religion. The same combined with, of course, making the emperor say he's no longer the god, making an announcement that he's not a god, that he's a human being. Within Japan, of course, you had a very repressive police state and a secret police, ideological police, and they dismantled this Naimusho as part of demilitarizing and normalizing the country. Of course, the war crime trials, we won't go into this so much, but after the war, of course, they needed to show and make a demonstration to, of course, not to the Japanese public, but also to those outside of Japan, who was responsible. And those top military men and those who were seen as having committed the most hideous or worst kind of crimes outside of Japan in the empire, they were tried for abuse of POWs, for all sorts of crimes. The top, so-called AQ Senpan, so the A-level war crimes criminals were 28 men, including General Hideki Tojo, one of the major generals. For commercial war crimes, crimes against peace, planning, waging war, aggression. 7 were executed, 16 given life sentences in what was called the International Military Tribunal for Parties, the Tokyo trials. This stopped, I think, 46 to went on for some time. And then this, of course, pops up, this Tokyo trial, later on in post-war history, as a sort of symbol of unfair justice, conquers justice. It's a kind of, if you're a revisionist, you see this as a way, as a very good example of victorious justice. It wasn't really just, and the crimes that they were tried for. In any case, there were no laws against what they had done back then. So it was sort of post-fact, creating laws to punish people after you've done something, which was seen as a problem. But we'll talk about that in a minute. How about the emperor? Emperor was, in the constitutional Meiji Constitution, he was the head of everything. He was the supreme commander of the military. Any kind of law or any kind of decision essentially was a result of the emperor saying yes. And the war, of course, was fought in the name. The wars across Asia, the war against the US was fought in the name of the emperor. Well, what happened? Well, it was a very difficult, tricky time. They didn't know what to do. There was a lot of debate within the SCAP. Shall we let him go or shall we try him? And this movie, it's not such a famous movie, but it's quite well done. Shows the internal discussion and debate of what to do with the emperor and whether we should try and hang him almost, or not. And finally, the decision was taken by MacArthur mainly that this is not a good idea. It will be demoralizing, and as a symbol of the Japanese people, if you execute the emperor, if you try the emperor, then it will create more instability. So rather than do that, focus on the other military generals and leaders and business leaders, but the emperor allow him to be exonerated. So this also creates all kinds of problems in the post-war history in terms of the Japanese understanding of what happened during the war and understanding of war responsibility. It's a big topic of discussion and debate. Okay. Along with demilitarization is sort of getting rid of bad stuff, getting rid of the cancer that had taken over Japan in the pre-war period. They need to grow something new. They need to recreate Japan. And this was the idea of democratization. What were they to do? They were to root out pre-war practices and institutions and relations to create a liberal democracy out of Japan in the image of U.S. So they tried to recreate Japan as a kind of mini brother of the U.S. Okay? That's very important. And this was one of the key goals at the early stages the main goals, early stages of the occupation. There are many. I'm sure if you have studied Japanese history in high school or in junior high school, you've heard of them and have been tested for them. So I won't go into so much detail. But those foreign students, or those who need refreshing, we'll cover them a little bit. So there are mainly 6 categories, I want to say. These categories are also not foolproof. You can say, well, doesn't this fit in here? What about this? Mainly 6, I would say. Land reforms, labor reforms, Zaibatsu dissolution, so getting rid of these big conglomerates, combined, reform of education, reform of local government, and then overarching all of this is to create a completely new state in terms of its institutions, in terms of distribution of powers, the legitimacy of how powers are used, the Constitution, creating a modern state, rewriting the Constitution. So far, okay? Nothing totally new, right? So boring, you know all this? Who knows all this? Okay. Oh, good. Well, you can pass out, but don't open your PC. Right. Land reform. What was land reform about? Well, pre-war Japan, one of the problems was that farmers did not own their land, and they tended to be owned by these very wealthy landowners, and farmers had to rent out land. And in that process, landowners tended to exploit their tenants, and their living conditions of the tenant farmers were very poor, and they tended to get into debt, and they tended to, be a very strong sense of dissatisfaction, I think. And one of the reasons why militarists emerged and rose and became powerful, 1930s, was this poverty in rural areas, poverty of farmers. And they see business leaders and politicians corrupt, enjoying their time in where would be the entertainment district in Tokyo at that time, Ginza, whatever, going to fancy restaurants and going to Gion or whatever, burning Ichiman Satsu and saying, look, isn't it right now? A famous picture in a textbook. The rich capitalist is burning Ichiman Satsu, Seien Satsu, Kakuen Satsu, in front of this poor waitress who's probably was born in a farm somewhere and couldn't stay because there was not enough food. So the parents sold off the daughter to the cities to work in these entertainment districts, whatever. This was a source of frustration. And a lot of the soldiers who came were from farms, second sons or third sons. And there's a lot of frustration, the fact that there's so much poverty in the rural area. So we need to change this. So what did they do? Well, they said all the landowners have to break up the big land holdings and give it away, almost free, to the tenant farmers. Those who have been tilling the land as rent, now you get it, you can own it. Think about that. It's almost like if you're renting your apartment in Kyoto and then suddenly there's a government changes and they say, okay, you don't have to pay any more rent. You just pay a little bit of money and you can own where you're living. Total revolution. Massive revolution. Or it's almost like a revolution if suddenly the government says, no more debts. Everybody who has any debts, no more debts. Amazing thing. What it does is it creates people who own land. If you own land, if you own property, what does it make you? It makes you conservative. I've also become very conservative after I bought my apartment. Why? You want to protect what you have. You have something to lose. You don't want instability that might take away your land. Okay? And even if it's a small parcel, if you own it, among other things, what it does is it makes you more efficient because you own it. So you want to get the best out of it, right? And to create stability. So landlords with more than 2.5 acres have to relinquish excess land and sell it to tenants at a very cheap price. And then there's some tenant farmers, but their rights were protected. Tenant farmers, about half of all farmers pre-war. After the war, it declines to 10%. So you have sudden expansion of land ownership. Many, because pre-war Japan was more rural than urban. There were more farmers, and 30-40% of the population were farmers back then. Most people live in the countryside. So you have to deal with that as a social group to create stability. If you don't own land and you don't have prospects in the future and you have lots of debt and you're frustrated, what could happen? There could be internal instability. Socialist, communist ideologies are very attractive to those who don't have anything. Extreme ideologies. So that was one reform, key reform. Labor reform. Pre-war period, of course, there was industrialization, urbanization, so you had a working class working in factories and whatnot, but their working conditions were quite terrible. Although it did improve during the war somewhat, but after the war this was legislated, so workers had more rights. They had right to bargain, collective bargaining, and make strikes, join unions. There was even the Ministry of Labor created to protect the workers' class and protect workers' rights, including women and small children. That is, small children no longer could work, whereas in the pre-war period you had 10 or 12-year-olds, 10-year-olds working in factories for the war effort. And there was no protection, but after the war it was established. Union membership was at 56% in 1949 on the statistics. I had peak levels of that 50s, early 50s, and then it starts to go down. Well, it's quite considerable. Now union membership is far lower. I don't know the exact figure, but far lower than this. Another thing that the occupation authorities focused on was this thing called zaibatsu. Zaibatsu are these huge business conglomerates owned by specific families, like Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo, Yasuda. They own a bank, they own a concrete company, they own a steel company, they own a shipping company, trading company. And they all trade with each other and help out each other. And it was central. It was seen as being central to the military production of steel shipping, chemical, and aircraft. And some went even to say that they are partly the ones who pushed the government to war because they will benefit, their war economy will benefit them. That argument is not quite sound, I'm not sure. But in any case, they focused on them and they said, we have to break it up. Having too much centralized, concentrated power, economic power. The same with having concentrated political power. We need to break it up. So they tried to break up into smaller companies and dismantle them, making them and introducing laws such as anti-monopoly laws. So you can't have too much control of a particular product or market. And Fair Trade Commission to do that. This was done. Break up Zaibatsu. Did it work out eventually? Well, a lot of Zaibatsu reformed. There was not really such an enthusiastic push for this reform, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Another area, maybe these two categories you can work on together, was education. Education, pre-war education, a lot of it was very ideological. A lot of it was to create the Shinmin, the subjects of the emperor that will sacrifice themselves, and everything was oriented towards the state being much more important than the individual. Okay? And not much focus on human rights or civil rights or individual rights, or the idea of democracy being citizens as opposed to subjects. So all this kind of militaristic content was cut out from textbooks and cut out from the education curriculum, and we tried to replace it with education content that encourage people to think in terms of being citizens, in terms of being members of the democratic society, having human rights, not washing out this talk of imperial emperor worship, obviously. At the same time, compulsory education was expanded to 9th grade. It used to be only until 6th grade, now to 9th grade, and it's sort of making sure that people are more educated. Universities such as this university, which was Teikoku Daigaku, Imperial University, has become no longer Kokuritsu, state. So there was, how many? 9 or so Teikoku Daigaku? They all became Kokuritsu. 9, 8, so I think there's 9 at the end of both parts. Anyhow, that was one way, and there's all this, anecdotes about how in the beginning in the elementary school textbooks, because they didn't get new textbooks yet, the new Democracy is Wonderful textbooks. They had the old textbooks. What they did was they had to black out all the ideological parts, with black markers. So you get a textbook and it's all blacked out. That's the part you really want to read, right? Whenever you have something blacked out. Anyhow, so those were the times. Very different from today. And then another element was local government, which seems like who cares about local government, but it's very important. And in the philosophy and mindset of the occupation officials, they want to make Japan like U.S. And U.S. is what kind of country in terms of local government? Federal. And local governments are strong, and was becoming increasingly centralized. But a decentralized system where local governments, state level, as also town and municipalities, cities, they were directly elected. There was democracy at the very grassroots. This was how democracy started originally, at the local level. So authorities thought Japan needs that too. They need to have a vibrant local democracy where people can experience what it is like to talk about things in their town or city and decide and vote, elect somebody from their own society or neighborhood, town.
May I ask
Yes.
something? Is that like outside of expressing more of democracy? Is that any push from we need to make sure that power doesn't concentrate in one place in central government, but also local governments have some power too.
Yes.
So
So
it's
there's
more
two elements. There's one element is to create a classroom for democracy. If you have local government, local mayors, local assembly, local voting, then you can experience what it is to make democratic decisions locally. And that's a kind of classroom. The other element, of course, is the idea of decentralizing power. So that because the central government cannot decide everything on its own, there will be a pushback from local governments and local governments will have autonomy, and then that will prevent the central government, even if it's a crazy central government, run away doing crazy things. There's some resistance. So we've seen that very, very, very nicely in the United States now, right? I'm not saying that it's a crazy government, but it's possibly crazy. Doing all sorts of things about immigration, right? Or, I don't know, try to get rid of illegal immigrants or try to ban certain people. Court-level decisions, of course, local courts are fighting back, but also local governments are fighting back. Some cities in the U.S. are what they call sanctuary cities, saying that we will not follow orders from the federal government to catch illegal immigrants and send them outside the country. So people are fleeing to these cities, perhaps San Francisco, some of these Portland, some of these. Balance of power by dividing power. Wait. Some other things like police should be decentralized, school education system should be decentralized, so local school boards, that is locally elected officials will decide the contents of the curriculum, who gets to be hired or fired. So Kyokuinkai was decentralized back then. And finally, the Constitution, which covers all these reforms. So part of these reforms are included in the Constitution as well. You need to know, of course, there's a lot of, once again, even to this day, there's a lot of criticism and debate and controversy about what the Constitution is and represents and means for Japan. Partly the reason is because it was drafted in a certain way. It was drafted by, essentially, Americans and American lawyers and officials in the occupation authority in a very quick time. Of course, it wasn't just one way. They proposed drafts, and then Japanese officials and Japanese lawyers looked at it, and there was a back and forth. But essentially, if you're occupied, there's not much, actual, substantial power in saying no, right? They drafted it. Although it was released officially by the Japanese government and promulgated by the emperor. So it's supposed to be a Japanese document, but in the process of creating it, was basically American officials, Colonel Cades, he was the chairman, so military guy, and it included some elements of the Constitution. It included pre-war constitutional proposals. So even before the end of the war, there were all kinds of drafts, so on, for new constitution of Japan. That was also included. So all sorts of things. MacArthur was very eager to get a new constitution done in end of 45 to early 1946, pushing these officials to go and create a new constitution. One of the person involved in the Constitution was this lady called Miyake Shirota, who was a 23-year-old woman who was Austrian-American, but she lived in Japan before the war, so she spoke Japanese. And she was assigned as a staff worker, and also as a translator, but I don't know how it came about that she was chosen, and she was chosen to write the constitutional articles pertaining to gender and women's rights. Okay, she did not have any legal training. She was not a constitutional scholar. 23-year-old woman, very big job for her. But she went to all these libraries in Japan to find German constitution, French constitution. She spoke to various professors, and then she came up with this. She was heavily involved in drafting elements of the aspects relating to women's rights. And she didn't say to the world that she was involved until much later, that she was one of the authors of the Constitution. So this is very interesting. This is not a big man theory, but this is a big woman theory, or young woman theory. Things can happen in flux period. Okay, very quickly, the Constitution. This is the first page of the Constitution, cover page. These are different daijin ministers. These are the names of the daijin. Kokumu daijin, Shitehara Kijuro. Kokumu daijin is what? 務大臣は何ですか In English. Prime Minister, I think. First Prime Minister in Japan after the war was Shirehara, right? Different Prime Ministers, and what's this? Hirohito? What's that?
Emperor.
The Emperor. This is his Emperor stamp. So when it was first promulgated, it was text, with the official approval of the Emperor. You can say, well, actually, even though the Americans wrote it, the Emperor signed off on it, so it's an imperial document. And a facetious argument. Anyhow, it's with 5,000 words, so it's very short, and it has 11 chapters. These are the chapters. It starts out with the Emperor. The first chapter is about the Emperor. Second chapter is renunciation of war. What does it mean to renounce something?
You
Huh?
give up on
You
the.
renounce. You give up. You give up on war. I was a war junkie. I did war every other day. I couldn't stop myself, but now I'm totally off war. Rights and duties of the people. So, basic rights, human rights. Then the institutions of government. The legislature, the cabinet, which is the executive office, and the judiciary. So, courts and supreme courts. Finance, self-government. Local self-government is newly introduced. There was no such chapter in the major constitution. Amendments refers to how you can change the constitution. Supreme law, some basic principles, and then finally some extra. Okay? Very short. There's some interesting study done about the length of constitutions. Okay? And the trend seems to be earlier constitutions tended to be shorter. And later ones become longer and longer. But Japan remains to be one of the very short, relatively speaking, even at that time, and even very much today. And his argument, my friend who wrote this, who was studying this, says that because it's short, it didn't need to be changed. If it's a short constitution, it's not so detailed. It doesn't specify so many things in detail. So you can change, you don't have to change, you just interpret it differently. Whereas if it's a long constitution, it's very detailed. So there are things you really want to do. You have to change it. You have to change the constitution itself. As you know, Japan's constitution has never been changed since 1945. Just interpretations. Textually not changed. Which means it's one of the oldest constitutions in the world today from its original form. Right. Well, just basic overview. What does it contain? Well, popular sovereignty. That is, the people are the source of power. Power is held by people, the citizens of Japan. And they can exercise this power through voting and choosing representatives, primarily. There's other ways of exercising power. And these representatives will use the power of the people in their interests and act in their interests by passing laws. Parliamentary system, bicameral legislature. So no president, and two representative legislatures, upper house and lower house. So this is both the philosophical core or value position, and also the institutional underpinnings to enable this. Emperor and aristocracy has lost all influence. They do not exist. They do not have any political power per se. They're just a symbol. Emperor is just a symbol. And they also got rid of the aristocracy system, formal system of aristocracies, peerages. You had baron something, or you have duke something. All these. You can't imagine society with these rankings of aristocracy. Gone. And House of Peers. House of Peers is the upper house. Former upper house used to be that you have to be an aristocrat to be a member. Now there's no such thing. Okay. And the benefits of being aristocracy is evolved. Bureaucracies and ministries and military even, well, there's not going to be any military in the new constitution, are all going to be controlled by civilians. It's going to be controlled by representatives of the people. Right? They don't have any autonomy, formal autonomy. All decisions that bureaucrats take, what the military takes is because the politician, who's a representative of the people, says, do it. That's theory, of course. In reality, there are oftentimes situations when bureaucracy does things which politicians didn't ask. Okay, and then a set of human rights which are universal, which cannot be violated. no law can trespass and go against these human rights. So Constitution, very easy to understand, is a super law. It's a law that determines what laws can be made. Many of you are legal students. And in that super law, there's certain rights, civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, religion, freedom from sabetsu is what? No, persecution. What's sabetsu in English?
Discrimination.
Discrimination. See, my brain is not working. Wires are shortened between the Japanese side and the English side. But anyway, discrimination. These sort of things have been set in law, set in stone now that it's in the Constitution. Unless you change the Constitution, you cannot pass laws that go against these rights. And minimum guarantees of education and welfare, so that people can live a reasonable standard life. So you can't be in abject poverty, and you cannot be totally uneducated in this new system. The Constitution guarantees certain quality of life. And that's why you have such things as Seikatsobo, which is unemployment insurance. Or that's why you have compulsory education. You must get it. In the pre-war period, you're poor, there'll be no help, at least from the state. But if you're uneducated, you don't have a chance to study, well, that's your problem. Discrimination, rights to women. We're not one Article 9. Well, I don't know if there's much point in going through all of them individually, since we want to go to discussion. But very quickly, emperor is a symbol. His position comes from the will of the people. He has some ceremonial duties. Award honors, meet ambassadors and ministers, ratify documents. Okay? Article 9, a very important article. Maybe we'll talk about this a bit more in the section when we talk about Japan and the rest of the world. But basically, we give up war. Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right. It's no longer the right of the state to use war to settle international disputes, to use force. In order to accomplish things, the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces as well as other potential will never be maintained. The right of the legitimacy of the state will not be recognized. Well, we all know that Japan has a self-defense force. So what happened here? Well, there's different interpretations saying that, well, self-defense is a right of state and recognized in international law, and self-defense was not included in this. So it's not a potential to wage aggressive, offensive war. It's potential for self. Civil rights and liberties, Article 1040, outlaw discrimination, democratic elections, suppression of the state. All these things, they're important. We don't have time to go through all of them. This is the institutional elements, bicameral legislature, power to be controlled by the prime minister and his cabinet, and the executive is accountable. Whatever law they pass, whatever they try to set out, the legislature, the Diet has to say yes, has to be decided. Supreme Court, judiciary has the power to challenge laws and state that they're illegal if they go against the Constitution. So they have an independent power. Theoretically. In actuality, do they really use this power? Question. Local self-government also in the Constitution says there shall be directly elected local legislatures, so Yukai, and local executives, so Kubicho, Shicho, Chiji. This is my favorite picture from Wikipedia, which I always use every year, and I always talk about this beard being very handsome, and this beard being very handsome. But anyway, this is the Meiji Constitution and how powers were separated, checks and balances. And it's very unclear who has ultimate authority. Emperor has ultimate authority, but you have different institutions, the military, the legislature, the council, the armed force, and the ministers. They all have direct access to emperor, and there's no chain of command. The people have limited power to control the state. It's only through the House of Representatives. There's only one player in this whole throng of actors. That was changed after the war. In the new constitution, institution, the people have direct control. Legislature, which controls the executive, and they also control the court. The court has control of the executive. The emperor is now outside without really any influence, they're just symbols. Okay. Compared to May's constitution, what? Sovereignty in hands of popularly elected legislature, open democratic competition, governments with politicians accountable to the voting public, executive accountable to legislature, no more outside advisors and privy council and general, people who are not elected having influence on policy, no more of that. No more behind the scenes struggles to gain the emperor's approval, because if you want to do something, you have to get the emperor's approval. Now you don't have to worry about that because the emperor is just symbolic. Okay, so that's the constitution, and these are the institutional changes. Very basic stuff. Any questions so far before we go to reverse course? Sort of running out of time. Okay? Sleepy? No, I'm sleepy too. Very quickly. What was the reverse course? Well, the policies, all the reforms that were, most of them were implemented, some of them not fully. They started changing direction, and there were other counter-reforms taking place from about 47 to 52. And this is what is referred to as reverse course. What had changed? Well, the international environment for Japan had changed. You have more tension between America and the Soviets. So Cold War is kind of heating up. There was a speech, Churchill saying an iron curtain has fallen over Europe between the communist states and the non-communist states, and two camps, they're going to be fighting each other. In the U.S. State Department and in U.S. Leadership, there was more growing view that we have to contain communism and we have to make sure that we have allies that are strong economically and able to resist communist influences. We need to have workshops and also, how do you say, kind of not fortresses, but places that allies, essentially in Europe will be Germany, and in Asia, Japan, that will serve to stop this flood of communist influence spreading across the world. And less emphasis on making sure Japan is ideal democracy, less emphasis on making sure that Japan is demilitarized, less emphasis on making sure that Japan pays back reparations, money to the countries that it caused trouble to, in Asia mainly. Okay, then that's the reverse one. Within Japan too, there was things that were developing that brought concern. That was the socialist and communist parties were strengthening. There was 20%, 28% support in elections in 46, 47. In 47, there was a socialist government formed, minority government under Katayama Tetsu, prime minister. Labor unions getting stronger and infiltrated by communists to some degree, and militant in their demands. And of course, the economy was still struggling, 47, 48, 49. It wasn't recovery time yet. So there was a concern that Japan might internally become communist. Of course, there's a lot of outside communist infiltration in part, but concern that, Japan will lose Japan in the Cold War struggle. So, reverse course. What kind of things did they do? For example, 1947, very early, they prohibit the general strike. They said first, we're going to give the right to strike, unionize, and then they took it away. This was a very big blow. Railway unions, I think, and mainly railway unions that their strike was blocked. Take away right to strike for public sector employees. So Home Wing can no longer strike. So I cannot strike. So I'm not happy. Even today, I can't strike. I'm sort of Junko. Anyhow, this we talked about Zaibatsu. Let's break up these huge conglomerates. This was scaled back. They didn't really enforce it, and they allowed the Zaibatsu to kind of reform. Because why? Because these are very efficient and effective economic engines. Because of being a conglomerate has a lot of advantages. In fact, they work very well pre-war economically. So post-war, if we let them be, maybe the economy will recover better, faster. Reparations are what you have to pay another country after you fought a war against them and lost. So there were a lot of discussion in the U.S. and of course Allied powers. Let's make Japan pay for all the damage it caused in our countries. Reparation by taking away industrial equipment, for example, or even asking them to pay money. This was dropped very early I'm not very, but by 1949, the Americans said, no, Japan doesn't have to pay back, or we won't take away industrial equipment. And in 51, 52, when they signed the San Francisco Treaty, the Americans said to the other Allied powers and also the other countries that suffered in the empire, don't ask for money from Japan. Don't press for reparations. Drop it. They pressured Philippines, for example. Stop asking money from Japan. Why? Because if you give money, it won't stay in the country. It won't be reinvested, and it will slow down economic growth. Communist Party was cracked down. Communist Party was legalized in 1946, 7, I guess 45 even. As a result, I mean, Communist Party is the oldest party in Japan from 1921. It was made illegal in the pre-war period. But now after the war, it was made legal, and they contested elections, and they were gaining support. But by 50, they cracked down and purged, citing, stating that it wasn't made illegal, but a lot of Communist Party officials were caught. How to explain? They were seen as, those who were seen as having positions, bureaucratic positions. So I need to get back to this. What exactly this pertains to in terms of ousting 13,000? Probably from bureaucratic positions or work public positions. They were, if you're a Communist Party member, then you couldn't continue for. I'll get back on this. I'm not quite sure about this. And of course, the Self-Defense Force. The Americans actually were the ones who were behind Self-Defense Force, in part. They encouraged, Yoshida Shigeru, the Prime Minister at the time, was encouraged to restart their own expanded police force, and which eventually became the SDF, by the behest, by the Americans. Why? Because they were worried that if there's some internal rebellion or revolt or some kind of uprising in Japan, they won't be able to put it down. And also because there's concern that Japan has to be able to defend itself from China or Soviet Union or even North Korea. Because the Chinese communists had won the civil war against the booming down the nationalists, which year? 1949, was it? Oh, yeah, 1949, right? So it was clear communists are on the rise, and Japan is in a very dangerous regional environment. And maybe the Americans, although they had bases stationed there, could not defend Japan from such threats alone. So first they give a constitution saying no more war equipment, and then suddenly they say, yeah, you better build up your own military. We can't defend you completely by ourselves. Reverse course. Okay, well, this is also important. This links into, Korean War links into the economic revival, recovery, which we'll talk about a bit more. It's not really reverse course. And at the culmination, at the end, 1952, well, Japan seems to be stabilized. The economy is starting to pick up, thanks in part to the Korean War, which Japanese companies in industry were suppliers of military equipment and all kind of material, not material, material. So their economy started to boom, stability, economic. The Communist Party lost election. The Socialists lost. And in 1948, Yoshida Shigeru returned to power. And politically and economically, it seemed to be stabilizing. Americans decided, well, let's give Japan independence. And 1951 September, San Francisco, find the countries who Japan fought war with. There's a peace treaty. All countries apart from Taiwan and China do not attempt, do not sign, and the Soviet Union as well don't sign the peace treaty. And they sort of say, okay, Japan, now you can go on your way to some extent, officially, and you're going to be the bulwark. That was the word I was looking for. The kind of defensive position, kind of fortress against communism in Asia, the most important ally. And the other. At the same time that the San Francisco Treaty was signed, it says in the book, moments later, almost at the same time, Japan signs a security treaty with the U.S., which allows the U.S. to have bases and troops in Japan, and officially it's to protect Japan because it doesn't have its own military. But another reason, some argue, is to make sure that there's Americans there, so that if Japan, anything happens in Japan, internal uprising, instability, there'll be Americans there to clamp down on. Also keep Japan in check, so that Japan doesn't return to its pre-war. This is kind of going all over the place, but Japan was set on a new course as a result of the San Francisco Treaty and this security treaty, and what's so-called the Yoshida Doctrine. You can do many lectures on this. But the essential idea is Japan will focus on economic recovery while enjoying security protection from the U.S. So it's a division of labor. Japan going to become the workshop of Asia and will become wealthy and stable. And they will pay money and it will help Americans be stationed in Japan. And it will be part of the Western camp. And it will trade and it will engage, it will join the UN eventually, it will join all these international organizations for the Western camp, have diplomatic relations with these states, and not with the communist camp. So we're entering into this US-led Western camp. And this was the main sort of diplomat IR position of from this point. Of course, there's a lot of debate internally and some changes and adjustments, but this is sort of the key course throughout post-war, and even today, one could say. Okay, but this settlement, San Francisco Peace Treaty and the U.S. Treaty, Security Treaty, and also this Constitution, all these things planted seeds of debate and divisions within the country. Already at the point, very early from the point of Security Treaty being signed, even before these protests in 1967, those on the left, the political left, the communists and socialists, were very unhappy. They said this goes against the principle of Article 9 to allow Americans to have bases and to be linked into this military pact with the U.S. and violation of Japanese neutrality. Those on the right, the conservatives, nationalists perhaps, could say, thought that this security treaty was a betrayal of national sovereignty. The middle course of Yoshida Doctrine was unsatisfactory for these camps on both ends. And this has caused tension in post-war Japan throughout. So you have the Kakushin and the Hoshu. One of the key divides is this. The other divide was about the Constitution. How it was written, the fact that it was written by Americans in large part, some elements of the Constitution, the kind of Anglo-American focus on human rights, and so they argued, was seen as not Japanese, and is imposed by the occupation. And it showed it created a subordinate relationship to the U.S. So both the right and the left, mainly the left, were happy with the Constitution. It's a bit how to say, ironical, but this was also another dividing line. Those who wanted to protect the Constitution and those who wanted to revise it. And this very early on in the 1950s. It continues on to this day. So just to remember, this is the seeds of the key divide, one of the key divides in Japanese society. Well, we're sort of running out of time. Lots of ground to cover. We have run out of time. Okay. I was going to go through how these reforms were received and which of them were successful, which of them were not, and who benefited from which reforms. This was going to be part of the discussion, but obviously I spoke too much. You can read this chapter 13. Is that right?
Is it the class until 2:30?
Isn't it? Or 2:30?
I think so. Isn't it?
2:30, right? 2:28.40. I have 1 minute. I'm not going to go into this discussion about the outcomes and these questions, which please think about. Are we okay?
Oh, no, I'm talking about if we have 10 more minutes or not, because according to my clock, it is like 2:20.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh.
and we have until 2:30.
Oh, okay.
I don't
Yeah,
know. Nobody
right.
agrees with me.
It says here 1:29, so
Your maybe your.
yeah, my PC is. Okay, good. We have 10 minutes. Okay, let's just end it here. I mean, we'll do a discussion now. So, first of all, do we have any questions on the content that I talked about now for 80 minutes? And I'm pretty exhausted, but any questions? No? You should read this, otherwise this becomes too much and too, yes?
I have heard that when Japan's self-defense force was renamed, like most of the elements in the hierarchy were taken from the military.
You mean the structure of
Yeah,
the
like
military
the
organization?
actual people who formed the Jietai were from the military. Is that correct? Or?
I don't know if I can answer that very accurately without looking up. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I do think that the structure of how a lot of it they borrowed from the pre-war period. But I don't know if the personnel, the actual people who became soldiers, who became generals or officers, were formerly pre-war military staff. I'm not sure about that. Yes.
Again, about the self-defense force.
Yes.
What I knew, one of the reasons Japan was able to create the self-defense force was the War of Korea.
Yes.
Because America had to send all the troops to South Korea
Right.
to fight against the communists.
Wonderful.
And is it true? I mean,
Yes, probably that would be one factor, and it links into the fact that Americans felt that they weren't able to defend Japan by themselves, so they needed Japan to stand up and defend themselves to some degree. So that might be an additional reason. But of course, Korean War ended in 1953. The beginnings of the SDF were 50s, 51, 52, but I don't think it was called SDF until 1955, a bit later. But certainly they wanted to have bases. They wanted bases for this defense of the region, not just Japan. Also helping Taiwan, there's another Philippines, for all of Asia. But they also wanted Japan to help out, not just by giving them land and giving them money. Eventually it became money to host the troops, US, but to have their own capacity. Very good. Anything else? Okay, well, there's a lot of things discussed, but I guess what we should think about in the rest of the term is what elements that we talked about today contributed to how Japan became later on. Right? It's a very big question, but in terms of its economic recovery, revival, and also its political stability or instability, because Japan had a lot of conflicts and tension through the 50s and 60s over the constitution, over the security treaty with the U.S., labor tensions between labor unions and such whatnot, labor unions and management, and these erupt into massive strikes, massive protests, right? Division of political parties to those Kakushin, Hoshu, these kind of tensions. They're all real, at the bottom, the source, the root, are these things that happen in the class we talked about. Another thing to talk about was how much of this benefited whom? Right? Which groups benefited most as a result of it? Could the occupation take place in a different way? Can you imagine a different kind of occupation which would have been better, perhaps? Was this the best occupation of Japan? Who thinks this was the best occupation of Japan? Who thinks it could have been much worse? Oh no, only some people. Who thinks the occupation could have been, can you imagine a worse occupation of another country? Historically, give me an example of an occupation of another country that didn't work out very well.
Iraq.
Iraq, very good. Yeah.
Vietnam.
Vietnam, yeah. Well, I don't know how long the French occupation of maybe Vietnam. Yeah.
Japanese occupation of Manchuria.
Very good, occupation. Well, if you expand it to when a foreign power controls another country for an extended period, so empire, right? So Japan controlled Korea and Manchuria, controlled Taiwan, controlled Philippines, Indonesia. Was that experience, how does that compare with the American occupation? Although it wasn't a formal empire, I mean, it wasn't an American colony, right? But it was an occupation. If you start thinking about that, I think, generally speaking, historically, this was a super successful occupation for both the Americans and for the Japanese. What happened after 1952 in Japan? Huh? It's a very big question. What happened? But how did it go?
Good.
Good, right? Economy grew, became the second world largest economy, third world largest economy. It became stable. There was no wars for 7 years still. I mean, compared to Eastern European countries occupied by the Soviets or I don't know, occupation of Manchuria, Japan, terrible infighting, economy weakened, all kinds of instability. So, in a sense, people complain about American occupation and imperialism as well. It was also in the best interest of the Americans. That's another thing you can ask. Why did the Americans do this? Was it purely out of idealism or was it for their own strategic interest? It's a combination of both. And what elements can you attribute to idealism? What elements can you attribute to strategic interest? Or maybe you can't separate them. But overall, I think Japan managed very well in dealing with the occupation authorities in the negotiations and got a very good deal. And they were very lucky to, in a sense. Korean War happened at the right time. Economic conditions were good, and so we'll talk about that next week. But they got on a wave. Okay. What kind of explanation are used? You can think about that. That's the last one. Good. So no questions. So if you want to borrow my book, how shall we do this? Why don't we do it by month? Who was born in January? January, February. If you're born in January, February, you can borrow the book. Your birthday. And don't lie. Otherwise, people run here and then it'll be a mess. Some kind of system. Is that okay? January, February. Who was born in January, February? Very good. If you want to borrow this book, come.
2月のそういう
理解しました。誕生日は1月2月の方は借りる権利があります。
でも
借りなくてもいいです。で、来週は next month, next
誕生日が1月2月の人借りていい。
read chapter 14, the next chapter, and read it. I'm not going to lecture so long because it's very boring for you and kind of distraction from each other. So,